For more than 250 years, a private company ruled vast lands, commanded armies, and shaped the destiny of millions. It began as a trading venture, but ended as one of the most powerful forces in imperial history. Today's story focuses on a dramatic turning point in the history of British rule in India. In 1858, that company lost everything. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for being here and for spending time exploring history together. The East India Company governed India for generations, not as a government, but as a commercial organization with political power. Its fall changed the structure of empire forever. Before we begin, consider this question. How did a trading company gain the power to rule a subcontinent, and why did that power suddenly collapse? Share your thoughts, and let us begin. In the year 1600, England took a quiet but ambitious step toward the wider world. Far from battlefields and empires, a group of merchants gathered with a single purpose in mind. They sought access to the riches of Asia, not through conquest, but through commerce. With royal approval granted that year, the English East India Company was born. The royal charter gave the company legal authority to trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. It was a commercial license, not a declaration of empire. The company existed to buy and sell, to move goods across oceans, and to return profit to its investors. Power, territory, and rule were not part of the original vision. At the turn of the 17th century, global trade was already thriving. Spices from Southeast Asia, textiles from India, and precious goods from across the Indian Ocean were in high demand in Europe. These commodities promised enormous profit, but access was controlled by long-established networks and powerful states. India stood at the center of this world. Its ports were busy, its markets sophisticated, and its rulers confident. Trade routes connected the subcontinent to Africa, the Middle East, and East Asia. Indian textiles in particular were prized for their quality and variety. For European merchants, India was not an unknown frontier. It was a destination of opportunity and competition. The newly formed company had limited resources. It possessed no army describing conquest, no authority over land, and little knowledge of local conditions. What it did have was capital, ships, and determination. Its success depended entirely on negotiation and acceptance by Indian rulers. The first voyages were long and uncertain. Ships sailed for months across dangerous seas, guided by imperfect maps and experience passed between sailors. When they finally reached Indian waters, they arrived as strangers. Every request to trade required permission. Every agreement depended on goodwill. Early company agents approached Indian authorities with gifts and formal requests. They learned court etiquette, relied on interpreters, and adjusted to unfamiliar customs. These interactions were careful and respectful, shaped by the understanding that the company held no power of its own. Trading posts were established along the coast, not as fortresses of rule, but as centers of exchange. Warehouses stored textiles and spices. Offices recorded transactions. These posts were often referred to as factories, places where factors or agents conducted business rather than production. On the western coast, Surat became one of the first important centers of company activity. It was already a major port, filled with merchants from many lands. The English presence there was modest, one among many. Trade flourished only because local rulers allowed it. Further south, additional settlements appeared along the coastline. Each followed the same pattern. Land was leased, not claimed. Taxes were paid. Rules were followed. The company adapted itself to the systems already in place. Life inside these early trading posts was demanding. Company servants lived far from home, coping with unfamiliar climates and disease. Success depended on patience, diplomacy, and accurate record-keeping. Profits were uncertain, and losses were common. Security was a constant concern. The company relied on local protection or hired guards. It could not defend itself against major threats. Any serious conflict would have ended its presence quickly. This vulnerability reinforced its dependence on Indian authorities. Indian merchants were central to company success. They supplied goods, arranged transport, and provided credit. Without these partnerships, trade would have failed. The company did not control commerce. It participated in it. Competition was intense. Other European traders sought the same goods. Rivalry played out through pricing, negotiation, and influence rather than force. The company had to learn quickly or be pushed aside. During these early years, the idea of ruling India would have seemed unrealistic. The company lacked manpower, authority, and intention. Its focus remained narrow. Buy low, sell high, and survive another season. Yet even in these modest beginnings, change was quietly underway. Permanent settlements created long-term presence. Knowledge accumulated. Relationships formed. Each successful voyage encouraged greater ambition. The company could not afford to challenge local power. Indian rulers remained firmly in control. They granted or withdrew permission at will. The balance of authority was clear. English merchants entered India as guests, operating within a world they did not own. Trade shaped the early connection between Britain and India. Profit drove decisions. Diplomacy ensured survival. There was no empire, only commerce. This first chapter was quiet, cautious, and uncertain. It laid no grand plans for conquest. It simply sought a place in an already crowded marketplace. Yet history often begins this way. With small steps taken for practical reasons. With ambitions limited by reality. With outcomes unseen. The East India Company began as a trading venture, shaped by negotiation and need. It survived because it adapted, learned, and depended on Indian power. In 1600, company rule did not exist. Only company trade. The authority of India remained in Indian hands. The future, still distant and unimagined, waited beyond the horizon. By the early years of the 18th century, the political landscape of India was quietly but decisively changing. Succession struggles and internal rivalries drained strength from the Mughal court. Provincial governors grew more independent, collecting revenue and maintaining armies with limited reference to the emperor. Across the subcontinent, regional powers rose to compete with one another, each seeking advantage in a fragmented political world. This environment created both danger and opportunity. Merchants faced shifting taxes, unstable protection, and sudden conflict. European trading companies had operated in India for decades under Mughal permission. Warehouses, trading posts, and small settlements lined the coasts. For a time, negotiation was enough. As political unity declined, that balance changed. The competition among Indian rulers drew foreign traders into local disputes. Requests for support became bargaining tools. Protection could be exchanged for privilege. Gradually, merchants discovered that influence required force. The British East India Company adapted quickly. It began to organize armed guards to protect goods, ships, and personnel. These forces were initially modest, meant to deter bandits and rivals. Over time, they grew more structured and disciplined. The company recruited locally, drawing Indian soldiers familiar with climate and terrain. European officers trained them in new methods of warfare. Drill, uniformity, and command replaced irregular defense. What began as protection slowly became a private army. Other European powers followed similar paths. But the company invested heavily. Fortifications were strengthened. Artillery was acquired. Strategic locations were secured. Trade posts evolved into fortified centers, capable of resisting pressure and projecting power. This militarization changed the nature of commerce. Trade interests now traveled with armed escorts. Agreements were enforced by threat as much as by contract. The line between merchant and ruler began to blur. At the same time, competition among Indian states intensified. Alliances shifted quickly. Rival courts sought external support to tip the balance. The company learned to navigate this environment skillfully, offering backing where it gained the most advantage. By the 1740s and 1750s, the company was no longer simply reacting to instability. It was shaping outcomes. Its forces intervened in succession disputes and regional conflicts. Each intervention expanded influence and deepened involvement. Nowhere was this more evident than in Bengal. One of the richest regions in India, Bengal was prized for its fertile land, thriving trade, and strategic position. Control of Bengal meant access to immense revenue and commercial opportunity. Political tension within Bengal created an opening. Court intrigue and rivalry weakened centralized authority. Competing interests sought allies. The company positioned itself carefully, aligning with forces that promised favorable outcomes. In 1757, this maneuvering culminated in a decisive confrontation. The Battle of Plassey was not a massive clash by numbers, but its significance was immense. The Compagnie's forces emerged victorious, supported by strategy, preparation, and divided opposition. The outcome altered the balance of power. Military victory brought political leverage. The company gained decisive influence over Bengal's leadership. Decisions once made by local rulers now required company approval. Control did not arrive overnight, but its direction was clear. Revenue arrangements followed military success. Wealth began to flow into company hands. With resources secured, the company expanded its army further, reinforcing its position. Trade transformed in purpose. Profit was no longer the sole objective. Governance entered the picture. The company collected revenue, maintained order, and enforced policy. Merchants became administrators. Soldiers became instruments of rule. This transformation reshaped the company itself. Its directors now oversaw territory as well as trade. Decisions taken in distant offices affected millions of lives. Military power sustained commercial dominance, and commercial wealth funded military expansion. For the people of Bengal, the change was profound. Authority shifted without formal conquest. There was no declaration of empire, only a gradual transfer of control. Daily life adjusted to new demands and unfamiliar systems. The company justified its actions as necessary for stability. In a fragmented political world, force seemed to offer order. Yet this order served specific interests, prioritizing revenue and security above local autonomy. Between 1700 and 1757, the Compagnie's journey reflected the broader transformation of India's political landscape. As old structures weakened, new powers emerged. The Battle of Plassey stands as a marker of this shift. It symbolized the moment when military power overtook diplomacy as the primary tool of influence. From that point forward, the company no longer depended on permission alone. Merchants had become military leaders. Trade posts had become centers of authority. Commerce had merged with conquest, not through sweeping invasion, but through calculated intervention. This change would shape the future of the subcontinent. Bengal became the foundation of further expansion. Revenue funded armies. Armies secured territory. Territory produced more revenue. What began as protection of trade evolved into control of land and people. The company crossed a threshold from which there was no return. It had become a power in its own right. The years from 1700 to 1757 tell a story of adaptation and ambition. In a world of weakening empires and rising competition, the company chose force as its path forward. The transformation from merchants to military power was not sudden, but it was decisive. By the time the dust settled at Plassey, the future direction was set. Trade had turned into rule, and a new era had begun, one in which a company of merchants would shape the destiny of a continent through arms, strategy, and control. In the years after 1757, the nature of power in India began to change with remarkable speed. What had once been a trading presence along the coast transformed into something far more ambitious. The East India Company, emboldened by military success, stepped beyond commerce and into governance. A new era began, shaped not by kings or empires, but by a corporation driven by profit. The turning point came with victory in Bengal. Access to land revenue altered everything. Trade, once the Compania's primary source of wealth, no longer seemed sufficient. The steady flow of taxes collected from fertile regions promised far greater returns. Commerce remained important, but it was revenue that now defined power. Company officials moved quickly to secure their gains. They negotiated treaties, installed friendly rulers, and asserted control over administration. Authority expanded not through a single conquest, but through a series of calculated steps. Each agreement brought new territory, each conflict ended with increased influence. Revenue collection replaced trade as the foundation of company wealth. Officials focused on land assessments, tax schedules, and enforcement. Systems were designed to extract predictable income from agriculture. Fields, villages, and districts were measured not by culture or tradition, but by their ability to produce revenue. With revenue came responsibility, and with responsibility came control. The company now governed territories directly. Its servants acted as administrators, judges, and military commanders. Decisions that affected millions were made by men whose primary loyalty was to company profit. Armies expanded alongside administration. The company raised its own forces, recruiting Indian soldiers under British command. These troops enforced order, collected taxes, and defended company interests. Military power became inseparable from economic ambition. Between 1757 and 1800, company territory spread across large parts of India. Each expansion followed a similar pattern. Financial pressure or political instability opened the door. Company intervention followed, justified as protection or assistance. Control soon replaced cooperation. Control soon replaced cooperation. This system blurred the line between governance and business. Company officials were paid servants, but they wielded sovereign power. They negotiated treaties, declared war, and collected taxes, all in the name of shareholders thousands of miles away. For local populations, the change was unsettling. Traditional rulers lost authority. Long-standing systems of obligation and protection were replaced by contracts and assessments. Taxes were fixed and enforced with little flexibility. Failure to pay brought penalties, debt, or loss of land. The speed of expansion created instability. Company officials often lacked deep knowledge of the regions they governed. Policies were applied uniformly across diverse landscapes. What worked in one area caused hardship in another. Yet adjustments were slow, as revenue targets took priority. The pursuit of profit shaped decisions at every level. Administrators were rewarded for increasing income. Success was measured in figures rather than welfare. This created pressure to extract more, faster. The consequences were felt most sharply in rural communities. At the same time, the company justified its rule through claims of order and efficiency. It presented itself as a stabilizing force in a fragmented political landscape. In some cases, its presence did bring temporary peace. But this stability came at the cost of autonomy and local control. By the end of the 18th century, the scale of company power was unprecedented. A private corporation governed vast territories, commanded armies, and controlled the economy of one of the world's richest regions. This arrangement had few parallels in history. The British government watched with growing concern. Reports of corruption, excess, and misrule reached London. As long as revenue increased, the system endured. Within India, resistance took many forms. Some rulers fought openly. Others negotiated and adapted. Communities adjusted where possible, endured where necessary. The Compania's presence became a permanent feature of political life. The transformation from trader to ruler happened rapidly. Its effects were long-lasting. Institutions created to serve commerce became instruments of governance. Profit shaped policy, and policy reshaped society. By 1800, the East India Company no longer resembled the enterprise that had first arrived as a merchant. It was a governing power, ruling India through revenue, armies, and administration. Its authority rested not on tradition or consent, but on contracts, force, and financial calculation. Control was justified by balance sheets as much as by guns. This period set the pattern for everything that followed. Company rule expanded through economic logic rather than imperial ideology. Control was justified by balance sheets as much as by guns. India, during these decades, was ruled by a corporation whose primary aim was profit. Governance became a means to secure income. Administration existed to support extraction. Armies protected revenue streams. The consequences of this transformation would unfold over generations. Systems built for profit proved ill-suited to justice and understanding. The rapid expansion of company rule laid the groundwork for future unrest. Between 1757 and 1800, company power expanded with astonishing speed. Trade gave way to taxation. Merchants became rulers. And India entered a new chapter, governed not by a crown, but by a corporation, whose ambitions reached far beyond the marketplace. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. This era revealed a fundamental truth. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. This era revealed a fundamental truth. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. This era revealed a fundamental truth. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. This era revealed a fundamental truth. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. This era revealed a fundamental truth. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. This era revealed a fundamental truth. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. This era revealed a fundamental truth. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. This era revealed a fundamental truth. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. This era revealed a fundamental truth. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. This era revealed a fundamental truth. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. This era revealed a fundamental truth. When commerce becomes control, and profit becomes policy, the lives of millions are shaped by distant decisions. The expansion of company rule was not just a change in administration. It was a redefinition of power itself. The world had never seen anything quite like it. A corporation ruling a subcontinent. The effects of that experiment would echo long after the 18th century came to an end. Company rule in India did not arrive only with soldiers and battles. It arrived through offices, records, and regulations. Administration became the true engine of power, reshaping society in ways that reached every village and household. What appeared as orderly governance carried deep consequences beneath the surface. As the company expanded its authority, it replaced older systems of rule with its own administrative framework. Local customs were studied, categorized, and restructured. Decision-making shifted away from traditional centers toward distant officials. Power became centralized, written, and increasingly impersonal. Land revenue lay at the heart of this transformation. The company viewed land as a reliable source of income. New revenue systems were introduced to maximize collection. Fields were measured, records created, and taxes fixed according to official assessments. For peasants, this change was profound. Revenue demands were rigid and inflexible. Payments were expected regardless of harvest conditions. Failure to pay brought penalties, debt, or loss of land. Traditional relationships between cultivators and local rulers weakened. Earlier systems had allowed negotiation in times of hardship. Compassion gave way to calculation. Pressure on rural communities increased steadily. Farmers focused on meeting revenue demands rather than long-term security. Borrowing became common. Debt bound families to moneylenders and landlords. At the same time, traditional industries began to decline. Company policies reshaped trade patterns to favor British interests. Raw materials were exported, while finished goods were imported. Local artisans struggled to compete. Handcrafted products lost markets to cheaper imports. Workshops closed, and skills passed down for generations faded. Many artisans were forced back into agriculture, increasing pressure on the land. Urban centers changed character. Ports and trading towns prospered, while older industrial hubs declined. Economic imbalance became more visible. Famines became more frequent during company rule. Crop failure alone did not explain them. Rigid revenue demands continued even during scarcity. Grain moved through markets, but access depended on money. Administrative order did not translate into food security. Relief efforts were limited and often delayed. Officials debated policy while rural communities suffered. The system prioritized revenue stability over human need. Local authorities who once managed relief had been sidelined or removed. Traditional safety nets weakened or disappeared. The state was present, but distant. Indian rulers were systematically displaced. Some were defeated in war. Others were absorbed through treaties that stripped real power. Princes remained as symbols, while authority shifted to company officials. With their removal, local governance collapsed. Customary courts lost influence. Community leaders answered to new administrators unfamiliar with local realities. Decision-making moved farther away from those affected by it. Company officials combined multiple roles. They collected revenue, judged disputes, and enforced law. This concentration of power left little room for appeal. Authority flowed in one direction, downward. Administration brought visible order. Records were kept. Boundaries defined. Rules enforced consistently. For the company, this order meant efficiency. Roads, offices, and courts appeared across the landscape. The state became more present in daily life. Yet this presence was often experienced as pressure rather than protection. Order served extraction more than welfare. Wealth flowed steadily outward. Revenue collected in India funded administration, armies, and dividends abroad. Resources left the subcontinent with little reinvestment. Economic drain became a defining feature of company rule. Indian society adapted as best it could. Families adjusted cropping patterns. Communities relied on mutual support. Resistance was rare, but resentment grew quietly. The company viewed its governance as rational and modern. But order imposed without flexibility deepened suffering. Authority no longer rested in local hands. It was concentrated in offices staffed by distant officials. This distance made suffering easier to ignore. The contrast between stability and hardship became stark. On paper, governance functioned smoothly. In reality, many lived with insecurity. The system worked, but for whom was increasingly clear. Company rule brought predictable administration and expanded control. It also dismantled traditional balances that had managed crisis and conflict. Where older systems had bent, the new one held firm, even when people broke. Over time, the cumulative effect was profound. Economic pressure altered social relationships. Communities fractured under debt and loss. Trust in authority eroded. Famines, debt, and industrial decline were not isolated events. They were connected outcomes of administrative design. Policies focused on revenue and trade reshaped lives at every level. Suffering was not accidental. It was systemic. The removal of Indian rulers created a vacuum. No local authority remained strong enough to challenge policy or adapt it. The company stood alone, powerful and distant. Governance became one-sided. Order was maintained, but at high human cost. The benefits of administration were unevenly shared. By the mid-19th century, the impact of company governance was unmistakable. Society had been reorganized to serve imperial priorities. Economic life was redirected outward. Local resilience weakened. Administrative control had reshaped India. It created a state capable of extraction and enforcement. It also created widespread vulnerability. Stability existed alongside deep suffering. Company rule claimed order as its achievement. But beneath that order lay exploitation. The structures that governed efficiently also drained resources and dignity. Authority expanded, while hardship spread. This legacy would not disappear with the end of company rule. The systems it built endured. So did the consequences. Administrative control had transformed India. And the cost of that transformation would echo for generations. By the early 19th century, a quiet unease spread across India. It did not announce itself in open revolt or sudden collapse. It moved slowly, carried through villages, courts, and cantonments. On the surface, company authority appeared secure. Beneath it, resentment grew. For peasants, daily life became increasingly difficult. New systems of taxation demanded fixed payments, often in cash, regardless of harvest conditions. Good seasons brought relief, but bad seasons brought crisis. Debt accumulated. Land changed hands. Families who had farmed the same soil for generations found themselves vulnerable to forces they could not control. Revenue officials measured fields and recorded obligations with precision. These records brought order to administration, but little comfort to those who struggled to meet demands. Taxes were collected on schedule. Failure carried consequences. The rhythm of rural life shifted from seasonal balance to constant pressure. Princes and local rulers faced a different, but equally unsettling reality. Kingdoms that had once held autonomy were absorbed through annexation. Treaties were revised. Courts were dissolved. Authority that had rested in familiar hands passed to distant administrators. The loss was not only political, but cultural. Patronage networks collapsed. Traditions tied to royal courts faded. Policies like the doctrine of lapse accelerated this process during the 1840s. States without direct heirs were annexed, regardless of local custom. Adoption, long accepted in Indian tradition, was dismissed. Each annexation sent a clear message. Company control would expand wherever opportunity allowed. These actions unsettled elites who had once cooperated with company rule. Loyalty became uncertain. Those who remained in power watched closely, aware that their position depended on continued favor rather than inherited right. Confidence in the permanence of local authority eroded. Urban centers reflected similar strain. Artisans and traders struggled as economic patterns changed. Traditional industries faced competition from imported goods. Employment became unpredictable. The promise that company rule would bring prosperity felt increasingly hollow to those whose livelihoods declined. Religious and social concerns added further tension. Reforms introduced with administrative intent were often perceived as disregard for custom. When changes touched belief, suspicion followed. Communities worried that their way of life was being reshaped without consent. Even small misunderstandings carried great weight. Within the army, alienation grew steadily. Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, formed the backbone of company power. They were disciplined, experienced, and essential. Yet their service existed within a structure of inequality. Pay was lower than that of British troops. Promotion beyond certain ranks was rare. Daily interactions reinforced separation. Orders were given, not discussed. Cultural practices were sometimes overlooked or misunderstood. For soldiers whose identity was closely tied to tradition and honor, these moments mattered deeply. Military service also demanded increasing sacrifice. Sepoys were expected to serve far from home, sometimes across unfamiliar regions. Extended deployment strained family ties. Concerns were raised quietly, but rarely addressed. Obedience remained, yet loyalty weakened. Across society, these experiences overlapped. Peasants spoke of taxation. Princes spoke of dispossession. Soldiers spoke of injustice. Each group carried its own grievances, shaped by different experiences, yet connected by a shared sense of exclusion. Company authority rested on fragile ground. It depended on cooperation from those it governed, yet offered limited voice in return. Administration emphasized efficiency over understanding. Policies were implemented from above, often without dialogue. This distance allowed resentment to grow unnoticed. Communication failures worsened the situation. Officials relied on reports and figures, not feeling. Obedience was interpreted as acceptance. Silence was mistaken for contentment. The warning signs of dissatisfaction were present, but rarely acknowledged. The expansion of company control created a paradox. As territory increased, trust declined. The system grew larger, but less connected to the people within it. Authority extended, but legitimacy weakened. In many regions, people adapted outwardly. Life continued. Markets functioned. Soldiers drilled. Courts operated. Yet beneath routine lay awareness that the balance had shifted. The sense of shared interest between ruler and ruled diminished. Resentment did not always seek confrontation. Often it took the form of quiet withdrawal or passive resistance. Compliance replaced cooperation. Respect became conditional. The emotional bond that sustained stability thinned. The company still governed. But the ground beneath its authority was unstable. Control existed, but confidence did not. The system functioned, yet it did so under strain. The growing discontent across India was not the result of a single policy or event. It was the accumulation of many changes, each small on its own, but powerful together. Taxation reshaped rural life. Annexation erased local sovereignty. Annexation erased local sovereignty. Military inequality undermined loyalty. Military inequality undermined loyalty. People began to see company rule not as a protector of order, but as a source of disruption. People began to see company rule not as a protector of order, but as a source of disruption. The promise of stability was overshadowed by experience of loss. Understanding this period requires attention to everyday life. To the prince watching authority slip away. To the soldier questioning his place within the ranks. These experiences formed the foundation of broader unrest. The company believed its power secure because administration functioned and armies stood ready. It underestimated the importance of trust. Authority can enforce obedience, but it cannot command belief. By the early 19th century, belief was fading. Resentment had taken root across regions and classes. It did not yet speak with one voice, but it existed everywhere. The conditions for challenge were in place, waiting only for a moment to bring them together. Company authority, though vast, rested on fragile ground. The structures of rule stood tall, but the soil beneath them had shifted. And in that shifting ground lay the story of growing discontent, a story that would soon reshape history. In the year 1857, the system that had governed much of India for decades faced its greatest test. What had appeared stable and controlled suddenly fractured. The rebellion that followed would shake confidence, redraw power, and change the course of imperial rule. The uprising did not emerge without warning. For years, pressure had been building across Indian society. Economic hardship weighed heavily on farmers and artisans. Traditional rulers had been removed or weakened. Laws and customs were altered by distant authority. Within the company army, Indian soldiers felt growing unease over pay, promotion, and respect for belief. Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, formed the backbone of company power. They guarded territories, enforced policy, and fought wars of expansion. Yet their loyalty depended on trust. That trust had been strained by cultural misunderstandings, rigid discipline, and policies that ignored long-held traditions. By 1857, many sepoys felt that the company no longer respected the unwritten agreements that had once governed service. In the spring of that year, discontent turned into action. Acts of defiance within military units escalated rapidly. Indian soldiers rebelled against their officers, seizing weapons and asserting control over garrisons. What began in isolated locations quickly spread, carried by shared grievances and sudden opportunity. Civilians soon joined the uprising. Farmers, artisans, and townspeople rose alongside soldiers, driven by anger, fear, or hope of change. For some, the rebellion offered a chance to resist economic pressure. For others, it was a response to the loss of political authority and social standing. The revolt was not uniform, but its momentum was undeniable. Northern India became the center of upheaval. City after city experienced unrest. Company authority collapsed almost overnight. Officials fled, offices were abandoned, and lines of communication broke down. Forts that symbolized power fell or were isolated, revealing how fragile control had been. The speed of collapse shocked company administrators. Reports that once spoke of order now described chaos. Garrisons were overwhelmed. Roads became unsafe. Messages failed to arrive. The systems designed to manage a vast territory proved unable to contain sudden rebellion. The revolt was not guided by a single leader or unified vision. It took different forms in different places. Some sought to restore old rulers. Others fought simply to expel company authority. Despite this lack of coordination, the rebellion posed a serious threat because it exposed widespread resentment rather than isolated discontent. British officials were caught off guard. They had believed their rule was secure, supported by loyal armies and efficient administration. The uprising shattered this belief. It revealed that company governance rested on fragile foundations, dependent on obedience that could not be guaranteed. Fear spread quickly through company territories. British families fled or hid. Officials struggled to maintain control with limited resources. The psychological impact was as powerful as the military threat. Confidence gave way to alarm, and routine to emergency. As resistance spread, the company responded with force. Reinforcements were summoned from Britain and other colonies. Loyal units were reorganized. A determined effort began to reclaim lost ground. Fighting was intense and destructive, leaving lasting scars on towns and countryside. By late 1857 and into 1858, British forces gradually regained control. Superior resources and coordination turned the tide. The uprising left deep wounds. Communities were divided. Trust was broken. The relationship between rulers and ruled was transformed. Even as order returned, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. In Britain, news of the rebellion caused shock and debate. The scale of resistance raised urgent questions. How had a trading company come to rule so much land? Why had it failed to maintain stability? Who should bear responsibility for governing India? The rebellion exposed the failure of company governance. A private corporation had been entrusted with immense power, yet it had ruled without sufficient accountability or understanding. Its focus on revenue and control had neglected the social and cultural foundations of stability. As a result, the uprising became a turning point. It convinced British leaders that company rule could not continue. The idea that trade-based authority could govern a vast and complex society collapsed under the weight of events. In 1858, the East India Company was dissolved. India came under direct control of the British Crown. The rebellion of 1857 had not ended foreign rule, but it had transformed it. For Indians, the revolt became a powerful symbol. Though it failed to achieve immediate independence, it demonstrated collective resistance. Stories of courage, loss, and sacrifice spread quietly through families and communities. The rebellion also reshaped future resistance. It showed that company power was not invincible. It planted ideas that would grow over time, influencing political thought and national identity. The Rebellion of 1857 stands as one of the most significant moments in Indian history. It was a collision between authority and resentment, between imposed order and lived experience. It revealed the limits of power exercised without consent. Company rule faced its greatest challenge and did not survive it. The uprising shattered confidence, collapsed authority in many regions, and forced empire to change its form. The events of 1857 did more than alter administration. They altered memory. They marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. What followed was not peace, but a new phase of imperial control, shaped by fear, caution, and centralization. The rebellion ensured that British rule would never again be exercised with the same assumptions. In 1857, India rose in resistance. The company fell in consequence. The echoes of that year would continue to shape the relationship between India and Britain for generations to come. By 1858, the rebellion had been crushed. British forces had regained control of cities, roads, and strongholds across northern and central India. Military authority was restored, and outward order returned. Yet victory did not bring relief alone. It brought doubt. In Britain, news of the uprising and its scale forced a reckoning. Reports described the sudden collapse of loyalty, the spread of resistance, and the violence that followed. For many leaders, the question was no longer how the rebellion had been defeated, but why it had happened at all. The answer, increasingly, pointed toward the East India Company. For decades, the company had ruled vast territories with armies, taxes, and administrators, all in the pursuit of profit and control. Now its system stood exposed. Confidence in corporate governance had been shaken to its core. British politicians, officials, and commentators began to speak openly of failure. They argued that the company had grown arrogant, distant, and careless. It had governed millions without sufficient oversight. It had enforced policies without understanding their consequences. The rebellion, they believed, was not an accident, but a result. Parliamentary debates reflected this shift in thinking. Members questioned how a private corporation had been allowed to rule such a large and complex land. They examined the company's record of administration, revenue collection, and military command. The findings were troubling. The company was accused of misrule. Its revenue systems were described as harsh. Its disregard for local custom was criticized. Its inability to sense rising discontent was seen as dangerous. What had once been praised as efficient governance was now portrayed as reckless authority. Even those who defended the company struggled to restore trust. The scale of the rebellion made denial impossible. Too many regions had risen. Too much force had been required to regain control. British leaders also recognized the political cost. The rebellion had damaged Britain's reputation as a stable and just ruler. It had revealed the limits of rule based on distance, profit, and force alone. Restoring authority required more than punishment. It required reform. Reflection turned into resolve. If Britain was to continue ruling India, could no longer do so through a company answerable to shareholders. Authority had to be direct. Responsibility had to be clear. Governance had to be tied to the state itself. This realization marked a decisive break. The idea that a commercial corporation could govern an empire lost all credibility. Corporate rule, once seen as innovative, was now viewed as dangerous. Confidence in the company was destroyed. The British government moved toward a clear conclusion. The East India Company would no longer rule India. Its powers would be transferred to the Crown. Administration would be reorganized under direct state control. The company had shaped British involvement in India for centuries. It had built armies, collected revenue, and expanded territory. Ending its rule meant dismantling an entire system. Yet the rebellion had shown that the system could not continue. The cost of maintaining it had become too high. The risk of another uprising was unacceptable. Plans were drawn up to manage the transition. Company officials would be absorbed or replaced. The language of governance changed. British leaders spoke of responsibility rather than profit. They emphasized stability, order, and careful administration. The state would now answer for India directly. This reassessment also reshaped imperial thinking. Authority could not be delegated without accountability. Power required understanding as well as force. The British response was shaped by fear as much as reason. Leaders wanted to prevent another crisis. They sought tighter control, clearer chains of command, and greater oversight of policy. The decision to end company rule was presented as an act of correction. Britain would rule India more carefully, more deliberately. The Crown would take responsibility for the consequences of governance. For Indians, the change marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The company, long resented and feared, would no longer stand between ruler and ruled. Authority would now be openly imperial. Yet this shift did not promise freedom. It promised structure. It promised order. It promised control under a different name. The British reassessment did not question empire itself. It questioned how empire should be managed. The goal remained dominance, but with fewer surprises and greater caution. In Britain, the rebellion became a reference point. It was studied, debated, and remembered. It shaped future decisions about colonial rule far beyond India. By ending company authority, Britain acknowledged that something fundamental had gone wrong. The rebellion had been crushed by force, but it had shattered assumptions. The belief that profit-driven governance could maintain loyalty was gone. The idea that distance excused ignorance was gone. Corporate rule had failed. In its place, the British state stepped forward. It claimed direct authority and direct responsibility. The Raj would be built on administration, law, and centralized power. This transition closed a long chapter in imperial history. Merchants no longer ruled as kings. Shareholders no longer directed armies. The age of company rule ended in disgrace and reflection. The British response to rebellion was not only military. It was political and structural. Victory on the battlefield led to transformation in governance. By 1858, the decision was clear and final. The East India Company would rule no more. Its authority, once immense, was dissolved. What replaced it would shape India for generations. The rebellion had forced Britain to look inward, to reassess its methods, and to redraw the foundations of its empire. The rebellion had failed to end British rule. But it had ended something else just as powerful. It had ended the idea that India could be governed by a company forever. From the ruins of corporate authority emerged a new imperial order, more centralized, more cautious, and more direct. The age of the company was over. The age of the British Raj was about to begin. In the shadow of the great upheaval of 1857, Britain faced a moment of reckoning. The rebellion had been suppressed. But its message was unmistakable. The system that allowed a private company to rule vast territories and millions of people had failed. And the need for decisive change could no longer be postponed. For nearly a century, the East India Company had exercised powers far beyond trade. It collected revenue, commanded armies, and administered justice. Its officials governed provinces, negotiated treaties, and waged wars. What began as commercial enterprise had evolved into political domination. The rebellion exposed the risks of this arrangement with devastating clarity. Debate in Britain intensified. Parliament examined reports detailing mismanagement, cultural ignorance, and rigid authority. Questions of responsibility dominated discussion. Who should answer for the violence and instability that had shaken India? Increasingly, the answer pointed away from a corporation and toward the state itself. In 1858, Parliament acted. The Government of India Act was passed, bringing an extraordinary chapter to a close. With this legislation, the East India Company was formally dissolved. Its armies, territories, and administrative machinery were transferred to the British Crown. The experiment of corporate rule was over. India was no longer ruled in the name of shareholders and directors. Authority now flowed directly from the British government. The language of governance shifted from profit to imperial responsibility. Under the Act, the Crown assumed full control of Indian administration. A new structure was established to oversee policy and decision-making. The role of the Secretary of State for India was created, supported by a council. Power was centralized, and accountability moved closer to Parliament. In India, the Governor-General became the Viceroy, acting as the direct representative of the Crown. This change signaled a new phase of rule. The British state now stood openly as the ruler of India, rather than operating through a corporate intermediary. The transfer of armies was especially significant. Company forces were absorbed into the imperial military system. Command structures were reorganized, and oversight tightened. Lessons from the rebellion shaped recruitment, deployment, and control. Military power remained essential, but it was now clearly an arm of the state. Administration also underwent reorganization. Departments were streamlined. Records were consolidated. Authority was clarified. The Indian civil service expanded its role as the backbone of governance. Bureaucracy became the primary instrument through which Crown rule was exercised. The Government of India Act was presented as a response to failure. British leaders spoke of learning from past mistakes. Proclamations emphasized justice, stability, and respect for Indian customs. These words were intended to rebuild trust after the trauma of rebellion. Revenue systems continued to fund administration and defense. Taxes were still collected, laws enforced, and order maintained through familiar structures. For many Indians, daily life did not change dramatically. Authority felt much the same, even if its source had shifted. The Act marked the end of company rule. But not the end of imperial control. Power remained concentrated in British hands. Representation for Indians was limited and carefully managed. The promise of reform existed. But progress was cautious and controlled. Economically, the logic of extraction endured. India's resources continued to support imperial interests. While the Crown replaced the company. The priorities of governance remained closely tied to revenue and stability. Symbolically, however, the change was profound. The dissolution of the company acknowledged that corporate rule had been inadequate and dangerous. The British government accepted full responsibility for India's governance, both in law and in history. This acceptance carried consequences. The Raj that followed was shaped by the memory of rebellion. Policies emphasized control, surveillance, and prevention of unrest. Fear of another uprising influenced decisions at every level of administration. At the same time, the Act altered political imagination in India. If authority now rested with the British government, then demands for justice and reform could be directed more clearly. Others remained skeptical, seeing continuity beneath new titles. These debates would shape the development of political consciousness in the years ahead. The Government of India Act of 1858 stands as a decisive turning point. It closed an extraordinary experiment in which a corporation ruled a subcontinent. It replaced it with direct imperial rule, more centralized and openly political. The British Raj emerged from this transition, carrying both the authority of the state and the legacy of company misrule. Its structures were designed to avoid the failures of the past, yet they inherited many of its assumptions. By ending company rule, Britain acknowledged that empire required accountability beyond profit. Yet the act did not resolve the deeper question of consent. India was now ruled by the British government, but not by its own people. The end of company rule marked the beginning of a new era. Governance was rebranded, authority reorganized, and responsibility assumed. But the fundamental imbalance of power remained. In 1858, Parliament drew a line under the past. The East India Company faded into history. In its place stood the British Crown, ruling India directly. The Government of India Act marked the formal end of company rule, and the start of an imperial system shaped by lessons learned through rebellion, control, and hard experience. This moment did not bring closure. It brought transformation. The act reshaped how India was governed, and how empire understood itself. It ended one chapter, and opened another, one that would define the next century of Indian history. After 1858, a decisive shift reshaped the future of India. The era of company rule ended, and authority passed directly to the British Crown. This change was born from crisis, memory, and fear. India was now governed in the name of the monarch. A new system was declared, formal and unmistakable. The Crown would rule directly, without intermediaries. The British Raj had begun. At the center of this new order stood the Viceroy. He represented the Crown and embodied imperial authority. From grand residences and official chambers, decisions flowed outward across the subcontinent. Power was centralized, visible, and symbolic. The position of Viceroy carried immense weight. He was both governor and symbol. Every proclamation, reform, and response to unrest bore his authority. India was no longer an overseas enterprise. It was an imperial possession. Administration was reorganized to reflect this permanence. Company offices were dismantled or absorbed. Imperial departments replaced commercial ones. Governance became more structured, more hierarchical, and more deliberate. Officials were no longer merchants in service of profit. They were imperial administrators trained for long-term rule. Their mission was stability, control, and continuity. The language of governance shifted from trade to sovereignty. The dissolution of the East India Company marked a psychological break. For decades, its officials had blurred the line between commerce and power. Now that ambiguity was removed. The state stood openly as ruler. Indian princes and rulers were informed of the change. Treaties were reaffirmed, but authority was clarified. The Crown was supreme. Local rulers governed only with imperial approval. Centralization accelerated across the administrative system. Policies were standardized. Records unified. Chains of command tightened. District officers answered to provincial governments. Provincial governments answered to the Viceroy. The Viceroy answered to London. Communication networks expanded rapidly. Telegraph lines connected distant regions to the capital. Railways allowed swift movement of officials and troops. The empire could now respond faster than ever before. Law and order became central priorities. Courts were strengthened. Police forces expanded. Surveillance increased quietly but steadily. The rebellion had taught the British that delay was dangerous. Every disturbance must be detected early. Every sign of unrest must be contained quickly. The Raj was built to prevent surprise. Military control was also reinforced. The army was reorganized under imperial command. Artillery remained firmly British. Recruitment policies emphasized balance and division. Indian soldiers continued to serve, but under stricter oversight. Trust was replaced by structure. Loyalty was assumed only through discipline. The army became a tool of prevention rather than partnership. Indian participation in administration increased cautiously. Educated Indians were appointed to subordinate roles. Their knowledge improved efficiency. Their authority remained limited. This inclusion was deliberate but controlled. It created cooperation without surrendering power. The Raj sought stability, not equality. Participation was allowed, leadership was restricted. The British presented direct rule as responsible governance. They spoke of order, justice, and protection. Proclamations promised respect for religion and tradition. Public reassurance became policy. Behind these promises lay calculation. The empire had learned that misunderstanding could be fatal. Caution replaced experimentation. Reform slowed. Economic administration was tightened. Revenue systems were refined. Land records standardized. Financial predictability became essential to imperial confidence. The Raj aimed to appear permanent. Buildings were constructed to last. Institutions were designed for generations. The language of rule shifted toward destiny and duty. British officials no longer saw India as temporary responsibility. They saw it as a core part of empire. Governance became long-term planning rather than short-term gain. The Raj was meant to endure. For many Indians, the change was immediately visible. The state felt heavier and more distant. Decisions came from higher offices. Appeal felt harder. Local authority continued to weaken. Village leaders and traditional courts lost influence. Imperial law reached deeper into daily life. Yet the Raj also brought predictability. Rules were clear. Procedures consistent. Administration efficient. This order appealed to some and alienated others. Stability came at the cost of distance. Control increased, but connection declined. The state governed effectively, but impersonally. The memory of rebellion shaped every aspect of rule. British confidence had been shaken. The Raj was built to ensure it would not happen again. Fear became policy. Governance focused on control rather than trust. Surveillance rather than dialogue. Prevention rather than reform. The empire had survived, but it had changed. By replacing company officials with imperial administrators, Britain formalized its rule. India was no longer governed by profit-driven enterprise. It was governed by imperial statecraft. The crown stood openly as master. The beginning of direct rule marked a new chapter. One defined by permanence and caution. The Raj did not promise partnership. It promised order. This transformation reshaped the future of India. The structures built after 1858 would last for decades. They would influence politics, economy, and society. They would also shape resistance. The British Raj emerged from rebellion determined to endure. It ruled with clarity and confidence on the surface. Yet beneath that surface lay memory of collapse. Direct crown rule was not just a beginning. It was a response to fear, made permanent through power. The end of company rule marked a dramatic moment in the history of empire. The East India Company, once a trading enterprise that grew into a ruling power, was removed from authority. Its disappearance was swift and decisive. Yet British control did not vanish with it. Power remained, but it changed shape, purpose, and tone. The fall of the company revealed a fundamental truth. Rule driven by profit and delegation had reached its limit. A corporation could not govern a vast and complex society without consequence. When crisis struck, responsibility could no longer be divided or denied. Authority had to be claimed directly. British control continued under the Crown. But the manner of rule shifted. Governance became more cautious. Decisions were weighed carefully, shaped by the memory of upheaval. The confidence that once allowed experimentation gave way to restraint. Empire survived. But it did so with a heightened sense of vulnerability. Centralization became the defining feature of the new order. Authority flowed from the top through clearly defined channels. Administration expanded and professionalized. Systems of record-keeping, reporting, and supervision grew more detailed. Knowledge became a tool of control. By understanding land, people, and movement, the state aimed to prevent surprise. Information replaced assumption as the foundation of governance. Suspicion shaped policy. Trust between rulers and ruled had been damaged. And it was not easily restored. Surveillance increased. Law and order became constant priorities. Peace was defined by the absence of disturbance, not by the presence of consent. This cautious approach influenced every level of administration. District officials were given broad authority, but also strict responsibility. They represented the state in everyday life, enforcing law, collecting revenue, and maintaining order. Their role was central, visible, and powerful. Political participation remained limited. Representation was introduced slowly and carefully, designed to manage opinion rather than empower it. The empire learned from the Campania's collapse. It recognized the danger of unchecked power exercised without accountability. The company had ruled with remarkable freedom, guided by profit and ambition. Its fall demonstrated that such power could provoke resistance strong enough to threaten the entire system. This lesson reshaped imperial philosophy. Governance now emphasized responsibility and oversight, at least in structure. Decisions were framed as duty rather than enterprise. The language of rule shifted from commerce to stewardship, even when outcomes remained unequal. For Indian society, the change brought mixed experience. Some welcomed the end of corporate rule, hoping for greater fairness and stability. Others found that control remained distant and unyielding. The form of authority had changed, but the imbalance of power endured. The memory of the company lingered as a warning. It stood as an example of how authority detached from accountability could collapse. Its story entered public consciousness as a symbol of excess and consequence. Even those who benefited from empire understood the lesson. British rule after the company was more rigid, but also more deliberate. It sought to avoid the errors of the past by limiting risk. Innovation slowed. Reform became cautious. The priority was continuity rather than transformation. This approach preserved control, but it also created distance. Governance became efficient, but less responsive. The state functioned smoothly, yet it struggled to inspire loyalty. Stability was achieved, but it rested on regulation rather than trust. The legacy of the end of company rule extends beyond administration. It reshaped how empire understood itself. Power was no longer something to be exercised freely, but something to be guarded carefully. The fear of loss shaped behavior as much as the desire for control. Unchecked power had been tested and found wanting. The Compania's rise and fall illustrated how authority without limits can provoke its own undoing. Empire survived by learning this lesson, even if imperfectly. Over time, this legacy influenced later developments. Demands for representation gained strength. Calls for accountability grew louder. The memory of corporate rule and its collapse added weight to arguments for change. The end of company rule did not bring equality or freedom. But it altered the trajectory of governance. It marked the transition from private empire to state empire. From delegated authority to centralized control. This shift defined the next phase of British rule. In the long view, the Compania's fall stands as more than an administrative change. It represents a moment when power confronted its limits. It shows that domination, when unchecked, carries seeds of its own collapse. Empire adapted, but it could not return to its earlier confidence. The shadow of the company remained, shaping decisions and attitudes. Rule became more guarded, more centralized, and more suspicious, always mindful of what had been lost. The legacy of the end of company rule lies in this transformation. Control endured, but innocence did not. Authority continued, but it did so under the weight of experience. The East India Company vanished, but its story did not. It remained as evidence that power without restraint cannot last forever. In its fall, the empire learned how fragile control can be, and how deeply history remembers those who wield authority without limits. The end of company rule marked the death of a corporate empire. What began as trade ended in political collapse. The East India Company reshaped India, and then disappeared from history. Its legacy remains in institutions, borders, and memories. Thank you for listening and for walking through this important chapter of history. May understanding the rise and fall of power help us better understand the world we live in. Until next time, take care, and stay curious.